Hello everybody, Logan Albright here. I want to do something a little bit different today. I'm reading this book by P.G. Wodehouse, who I have extolled the virtues of on this channel before. This is A Gentleman of Leisure, one of his lesser known works, but a very enjoyable one. I'm enjoying it a lot. And one of the interesting things about it that I noticed while reading it is the improbable number of contrived coincidences that occur. There's the basic plot is this young rich man about town encounters a beautiful girl on an ocean liner going from England to America, and then he doesn't know her name and he doesn't know how to get in touch with her, and then he miraculously runs into her in America, in New York City, and then again later in the book he miraculously runs into her in England. Highly improbable, would never happen in real life, and I really enjoyed that in this sort of book. I think it's really fun, it makes me laugh, it makes me happy. And I was thinking about how in like creative writing courses or in style guides and manuals that tell you how to write, they talk about how bad that is, what bad writing it is to have coincidences, how you should try to adopt a more realistic explanation for the things that happen in your stories. And this is one of my problems with style guides and things that tell you how to write, because there's an exception to every rule. And so I came up with 3 exceptions in the fashion of the internet numbered list. 3 reasons when it's okay to use a contrived coincidence, and when it's not only okay, but it can actually benefit your story or make the story better. Number 1 is when the genre calls for it. So the P.G. Wodehouse book is obviously, it's a farce, and it's a romance as well. It's both a farce and a romance. And these are both genres where you can really get away with crazy coincidences, because they're not meant to be taken seriously. They're not dramas. They're not, serious character studies or emotionally driven things. They're there for fun. And everyone knows they're not realistic. Rom-coms are not realistic. Comedies are not realistic. Everybody knows this. And so putting in these crazy coincidences, it kind of lifts you up out of your ordinary, serious, everyday, mundane life, and you get to experience something that's a little bit more fantastical and unrealistic, and that's fun. That's part of the reason that I think we like fiction, is that it's not a perfect reflection of the way we experience life. It allows us to experience things that we don't already have in life. So things that are unlikely to happen in real life happen a lot in fiction because it's more interesting. It's more interesting than real life, and it's fun. So the genres where I think it works really well are farce, romance, and then things that are operatic or exaggerated, like space opera. Like Star Wars is full of crazy contrived coincidences. And it works fine because it's Star Wars. You're not meant to take it seriously. It's a fun little fantasy. Fantasy is another one where it can work out if the fantasy is not meant to be taken too seriously. If it's not high fantasy, it can work out just as well. There's a writer who I mentioned in one of my very early videos on this channel that nobody watched, called Harry Stephen Keeler. And I recommend you go watch that video because he's awesome and you should read him. And he was a pulp detective writer in the 30s who wrote these really crazy, over-the-top mysteries that have tons of crazy contrived coincidences in them, and they're hilarious and they're loads of fun, and you can get away with it because the genre is allowing of that sort of thing. Number 2, situations when it's okay to use a contrived coincidence is when it's part of the premise of your story. The reason people don't like coincidences that feel contrived is when it's used as a band-aid for sloppy writing. When you've written yourself into a corner and you don't know how to get out, and so you just have something crazy happen and it solves the problem. Readers are sensitive to that. Readers can pick up on that, and they don't like it because it shows that the author is lazy and doesn't know how to get themselves out of the situation they've gotten themselves into, and it just smacks of bad writing in that case. Readers can pick up on it. Don't do it. But if the very premise of the story you're writing requires or calls for a contrived coincidence, then it's okay, because you're not using it to get out of trouble. You're using it as a jumping off point. So if you want to write a story about a man who has something extraordinarily unlikely happen to him 3 times in a row, and that's the premise of your story, I think that's great, and that could be a lot of fun. And you're not going to be violating any rules of writing to the extent that there are rules of writing by doing that. An example for this category that I would thought of is like Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump involves the main character showing up at a lot of pivotal historical moments and being part of these historical moments in a way that no one person ever would be. The civil rights movement, meeting Nixon, the space program, the Olympics, like all kinds of stuff, Vietnam. It would never happen in real life, but that's the point of the story. It's like, what would happen if there was one guy who was, unwittingly present at all of these major historical events? So that's when it works really well. Number 3 is, then this one you got to be careful with because it's easy to abuse, but it's called hanging a lantern on it. You can get away with a contrived coincidence when you point out to the audience that it is in fact a contrived coincidence and it is in fact lazy. And you can do this mainly in comedy genres, and not all the time, because again, audiences are sensitive to this kind of stuff. They can tell when you're being lazy and they can tell when you're being funny. But it can be done in a really funny way, and it can be used to cover up a contrived coincidence and make it, instead of making it detract from the story, make it add to the story. The Simpsons writers do this a lot. The Futurama writers do it a lot. The example that I'm thinking of comes from a Futurama episode in which one of the main characters, Bender, has been floating out in space for a long period of time and gets rocketed back to Earth, and he lands like 2 feet from where his friends happen to be standing at the time. And one of them says, "This is by far the least likely thing that has ever happened." And that's the punchline of the joke. If that had just happened with no comment, it would be like, how did that happen? That's too unlikely. That's a contrived coincidence. But having one of the characters point out that's by far the least likely thing that's ever happened calls attention to it, makes it funny. It lets you know the writers know what they've done and they're doing it consciously, and it's not just being lazy and bad writing, because they're doing it on purpose. They know what they're doing. So that's my 3 examples. There are probably others that you can think of times when it's okay to use a contrived coincidence. I always object to these kind of writing guides that tell you how to write and how not to write, because there's always counterexamples. You can always find people who are breaking the rules and doing innovative things and writing great literature. You can look at people like James Joyce or E.E. Cummings or William Faulkner, who just defy all literary convention and do something completely different, and people love them for it. And so I never want to tell people you can't do that, that's wrong, because it all depends on the application, it all depends on how you do it, it all depends on how it's handled. It doesn't mean you can't ever do something. You can do it if it's handled in the right way, and if it's handled expertly, and if it's handled deliberately, and you're doing it on purpose rather than because you don't know what else to do. So I just wanted to do this little video to point that out, because it was something that occurred to me while reading this excellent P.G. Wodehouse book. Go read more P.G. Wodehouse, go read more Harry Stephen Keeler, and I'll check back with you next time with another book review. I've been Logan Albright. I hope I will get your like and your subscription, and we can keep making this content together, shall we? Have a good one.